speakers are Alan Kessler, who is the Director of Delivery at Utopia, who specializes in SAP plant maintenance and enterprise asset management. Alan has over 30 years of experience in the field as a journeyman instrumentation technologist and is considered to be a leader on the SAP CMMS, data management, planning, and inventory management. His history is very rich in the operations and maintenance space, both on and offshore, and has worked for greats like Shell Canada and Spectra Energy. Jonathan Budd, who is our second speaker, is the Director of Sales for North America East and Canada. So I'm going to hand over the presentation to Jonathan now. Take it away.
Thank you, everyone, for taking some time out of your busy schedules to join this webinar. Hopefully you'll find it enlightening. Let's take a look at what we're going to cover on today's discussion, and then I'll hand it over to Alan for the majority of the discussion. In today's webinar, we're going to cover some of the root causes of inefficiencies in the processes in our heavy asset industries, and what can we do about it. So some of the challenges that we're facing today in our industries, in the current economic climate, what can we do to improve, or what do we want to do to improve, and how can we improve it? And if we do it right, how much can we save on our cost portfolio by improving our processes? And last but not least, how do we get started? If we'll look at this from the perspective of an instrument journeyman, obviously that's Alan, my colleague and partner in crime here. Alan has got some unique experiences with his experience in the field. He's seen many of the processes that we'll talk through today and seen some of the challenges that we're all plagued with. But he's dumbed it down into some root causes that really do have some significant impact on the efficiencies of our processes. So we'll look at it from that perspective. And at the tail end of it, we'll cover what some of the heavy asset industries, the companies in the heavy asset industries, are doing today to combat some of these inefficiencies. So some of the economic pressures that we're faced with today, and none of these will be a surprise to most of you on the phone here, we're always under pressure to have more efficient operations. Our margins are constantly under pressure. The focus is always on getting more out of our existing assets and optimizing our existing production infrastructure to both manage our capital spend and contain our operational costs. So one of the things that we've run into in the recent months is the need to do cost reductions to map to the current economic conditions. One of the challenges in that is we can't just cut costs by cutting personnel or cutting services. What we have to do is figure out how to cut costs in a sustainable way. So that means our total cost of ownership can actually be reduced if we're cutting costs in a sustainable manner. Simply cutting maintenance resources is good for the short term, but it does have long-term implications on both our reliability and our reliability of our equipment and our long-term spend on capital. The third part is inventory management. How do we contain costs on all of the parts and equipment that we have to store in order to maintain our equipment? What can we do better to improve utilization across these assets? And how do we get rid of some of the inventory that we don't need anymore for all these parts, obsolete equipment? And obviously the goal is to create resilient and agile operations. We want to be able to move with the market conditions. We want to be able to adjust and create efficiencies anywhere along our processes as things change in our environment. So let me start by asking Alan a couple of questions, and just to kick things off here. In your experience as an instrument journeyman, Alan, where have you found challenges and inefficiencies in the field?
Yeah, Jonathan, I started in the early 80s in plants that were built in the early 60s. And there was a lot of tribal knowledge as I came up, people that had been in the company for 20, 30 plus years. And they had all the information in their heads. And there was no documentation of standards or guidelines, not as much regulations at that time. So data really wasn't considered a huge asset. So now what's happened over the years, regulations have come in. The type of employees that you have in companies, you don't see very many companies anymore with those long 20 and 30-year employees. So as regulations came in, you started to have to know what your data was and what your assets were and what maintained them. So I went from that kind of a culture to a brand new oil production platform, the Hibernian platform off the coast of Newfoundland, which was highly regulated, in an environment where you had to be safe. And all of a sudden, data became very, very important. Knowing what parts you had were so remote, at $1 million a day downtime, you had to have the right parts because it wasn't a drive to go get something. It's hours on a helicopter in the foggiest place on Earth. So very quickly figured out the value of having the right data and very limited space to store things. I've worked in lots of plants helping them with their data, and what you find is the first place I go into somebody's warehouse to tell you what the health of their data is. And if the warehouse is packed full of parts, you know that they probably don't have very good data because they're not trusting. They know that they have the right parts, or they don't retire parts when they've retired the equipment. So data has become super critical now, especially with regulations, to prove that you're doing what you say you're doing.
So it sounds like some of the data, or some of the root causes of the inefficiencies is the data or the lack thereof in the ability for the folks in the field to actually execute their jobs. So if we've seen this as a major cause of inefficiencies, how have you managed to get appropriate attention to the data issues of your clients so that they're willing to put in time, effort, and resources into fixing them?
Right, and that's really about understanding the life cycle of your data. So, here's a representation of where data comes into your companies. And in the past, like I said, in the 50s and 60s, we didn't have any of this data. It was all in paper copies and books. Nowadays, we have all the electronic data, so it's so much easier to manage. And we know we can save a lot of money by knowing what we have in the field. We can improve our reliability and processes. So in this drawing, you can see how we start out at engineering, where we're designing things. There's a lot of design specs and things that come in. So that's important to know how we've designed something to work. And then we actually procure it. And now what you procure and what you design are usually two different things. So you need to know what you actually are installing. And usually it's what you're buying is over-designed for what the engineers really needed. And then, so you end up with all those equipment characteristics documents as you're building. You have red lines where you change it. It doesn't work, it doesn't fit. And things like that. So again, during construction, things change. And then when you commission the equipment and actually get it running, you end up changing the equipment out as well because the design isn't quite working the way they expected. So all of those places, you see all this data changing as you're building a new facility. And a lot of times in older plants, a lot of this data, you don't have it anymore. It's in filing cabinets, and it's very dated. So then once you have operations and maintenance and reliability happening, that's where the data has the most value for you. Operations needs to be able to find the data so they can report on malfunctions, find in their assets. Maintenance needs to find it and know what it is, and they need to understand what the recommended spare parts are and things like that. So that's where the bill of materials comes in so handy for maintenance, knowing what the right parts are. And then reliability is all about keeping the machinery running and keeping its life cycle longer. So the time duration for where the data is most valuable at the top of the curve, that's could be months, if it's a small term project, or it could be 30, 40 years. That data is so important to keep your plant running safe and reliable. And of course, then the biggest thing we usually find is when it goes out of service, people don't retire the data. They don't retire the equipment. They don't take parts off the shelves. And all of a sudden, you're starting to fill your data sets, your warehouses, full of things that are actually out of service and should be dismantled and retired and scrapped properly. So we find a lot of times that people can't even find the data they're looking for because it's so cluttered with retired data. So that's how we started. We start looking at the data and breaking that down so we can understand how to find the data. So that hopefully explains how your asset data from cradle to grave, how it should be managed. So once we understand that, now it's a lot easier for us to start breaking it down.
So, Alan, what mechanisms have you used to get attention to this at the upper levels so that the companies will actually put time and effort and resources into this?
Right. So we have to come in and figure out how to turn this into bite-sized pieces, because the biggest thing I usually hear in the industry is we know our data is bad, but we can't quantify it, and we don't know where to start because there's just so much. It's the Mount Everest of data that companies have, and they just don't know where to start. You can't go bang on somebody's door and say, give me $2 million to clean my data just because I know it's bad. They usually ask you, well, show me what it is that's wrong and what you're going to do to fix it. So this is where we started, is really three major pieces of this: is the people, the process, and the technology. So the people, again, we look to people who govern the data, your master data specialists. Do you have standards and guidelines, things like that in your company? A lot of companies don't have standards and guidelines or a center of excellence. They usually just have a person who looks after the data, and they practice doing something. So they want the data to look better, but they're just on their own doing it and not necessarily supported. And of course, there's the process. A lot of companies' management of change isn't well documented or not down to the level of equipment. They usually document they're adding a new whole station or something like that, but not necessarily a new valve or replacing a pump. How they govern the data, those procedures are very important in the process part. And of course, then there's a lot of companies who also don't even have the technology. They don't have CMMS tools that necessarily handle all of this data. A lot of them work off Excel sheets and access databases and homemade software. So, we're very SAP-centric. I've worked with SAP for most of my career. And knowing how it works and what it can manage is awesome. And now with the new technologies SAP is applying to make it the user interface even better, really helps to enable people on the floor to do this. So the other thing is then what we do is we go into an assessment, and that's once we understand those three things, that's where the sweet spot in the middle is really that ADLM. We touch on all those areas. So we look at things like, what kind of governance do you have? What are your standards and guidelines? And if you don't have those, what are your procedures and practices? And then we're able to use our data services and information steward out of SAP, which data services allows us to do complex measuring of the data, and information steward helps us report on those to make an understandable report of what we're finding in the data. And then we also once we understand the data, what's wrong with it, we can now do data enhancement where we get to make model serial numbers of equipment, so we can add bills of materials and add those materials in your warehouse, because ultimately every material that's maintenance specific in your warehouse should be connected to a bill of material which is connected to that piece of equipment in your facility. So when you're replacing it, you can take those parts off the shelf. And we find lots of warehouses, there's so much space, 30-40% of the space is taken up by parts that you don't necessarily need anymore. Or if you really thought about the risk of not having that material, or it's available across the street, why do you have it in your warehouse? So that allows you to do that. And it also allows you, when you have capital projects, to remove those parts as part of the capital project. So that gets missed without knowing that data, without knowing that part's connected to your group. And of course, we do data monitoring management with those tools, data services, information steward. Once we've set them up against your rules, we're able to actually watch your data and keep it healthy and know where your data is changing. So that's the initial part where we start with the ADLM assessments. Are you there, John?
So it sounds like the ADLM assessment will bring some of the details or the facts in the data to light and give you some rubber on the road to take to management with enough business implications that could possibly get some attention to this. You've got some examples of some of the reports that would come out of an ADLM assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I've got this bill of material. That's the next logical step, is what are the rules? So we've got out-of-the-box rules. We've got 200 or 300 rules that we know from working with all our customers that these are leading practices. If you're having a CMMS system where you're managing your data, you need to know these things. So here's an example of a bill of material, which we know which fields must be filled in. Bullet point number 3, how many bombs without materials are orphaned and not attached to a functional location or equipment? So what's happened is they've retired the equipment, the bill of materials floating around in free space, not connected to anything, so it's a list of materials that's not useful for you anymore because you don't even know what it belongs to. And then So we find a lot of that where data's been orphaned. And again, that's back to that not retiring things properly. So we look for those kind of things. And so as an example, and for bombs, you can see we have 8 or 9 questions here that we, right out of the box, start looking at. And we do it for equipment, we do it for function locations, we do it for materials, we do it for all the other objects, not just EAM objects. We do serve master, cost centers, all those type of things. So we want to assess the data to these rules that your business uses, typically. And here's in a case where we looked and we found 31,000 bombs out of 212,000 bombs that were floating around in space that had materials attached with them. So that really shows us how the bill of materials can end up not being used properly.
So it looks like the report here will give us some really good information on where the gaps are in our data and what the potential implications are for us operating on our business processes. So if we can look at this and we can say, now we know what we need to fix and why we need to fix it. How do we get started fixing the discrepancies in the data? It seems like a daunting task with massive amounts of data around our equipment.
Yeah, definitely is. So, so here's an example of what you're talking about. So here's an example data, sample data of equipment profiling results, just to show that we do other things. So we remove all the deleted records or that are marked for deletion, maybe not properly, but they're marked. And we identify those. We clean those up right away. And then we actually start looking field by field if there's errors in the data, and then we start looking across fields and across objects. So in this case, you can see here's how many records we've identified that don't meet the standards that we want, where things are supposed to be completely filled. We also provide the data set that goes with this. So if there's 100,000 records or 9,000 records, here's the actual report that shows you which those 9,000 records are. So that's the first step, is to understand what data isn't matching against the standards and guidelines that you want to put in place in your company. So we do a lot of work up front to get those rules in place, then we measure them this way. The next part then is, here's equipment again, where we're now prioritizing what our findings are. Do you need to clean that data immediately? If it's make, model, serial number of a pressure safety valve, and you're supposed to have 100% of those accurate for regulatory reasons, you may want to jump on those right away and go in the field and actually, or look up records and find a way to fix those records right away. Other records, you might be doing a migration to a new system, or you might just be updating it. So part of the plan is, hey, when we move all this data all at once or correct it all at once through automation tools, whenever that live data is, we'll fix it during that. So if ABC must equal 1, 2, 3, we'll put a rule in place in our tools, and then when we migrate the data or fix the data, it'll be the right values that we expect it to be. And of course, the last type of data is the data that you have to do manually. So it might be, here's 6 materials in your warehouse, or here's a bunch of pumps that are missing data, and you send those reports out to the field, and the people go out and collect that data for you and send it back to you so you can update your data to meet your standards and guidelines that you put in place. So really looking at the big aim of this is you want to work on the ones that are most important to your business, that show the most value for the investment that you're making in your data, to make sure that you're meeting those regulatory requirements first, and then keep enhancing your data and being able to attach bill of materials. So now you can actually manage your warehouse inventories, attaching all the right parts to it so that reliability can look when they see consistent failures, that they know how to find that and report on that and make your plant more reliable and more trustworthy operations. So that's the type of things we do to start remediating data.
So when we get into the remediation piece that you're talking about, and we start looking at some of the gaps in our data, can you give us some examples of how you would go about collecting the data that's missing?
Well, some of the ways you have to do is we have to start putting standards in place. So here's an example of materials taxonomy. So when you have a bearing, there's different types of bearings. So you have a cam follower bearing, a cartridge bearing, or hanger bearings, as examples I've got here. You want to lay out standards that say, what is the data we need first? So we truly understand what it is we need to collect on our materials or even on our equipment. So we have some equipment standards as well, like for a centrifugal pump like we have here, how we code it, what its boundaries are, and here's all the characteristics for that pump we would collect. So once we agree to those standards and guidelines, and to do that, you're going to have to build a center of excellence. And by that I mean a team of people who are responsible for the data and the rules that you put in place. So you can build these type of documents where you apply standards to your company and apply that to your data consistently. So that's the first place you have to start. If you don't know what you want your data to look like at the end, it's really tough to go out and just randomly collect everything that you think you need. You want to collect only the things that are important to your business and to your reliability. So laying out those standards is the first step on how we start collecting that. So once we have that structure in place, now we're able to also measure the data against it and then determine users in the field, business, IT, whoever we need to have to start correcting this data. That's how we can do it. Start doing as much as we can electronically from your records. A lot of times in materials, the data's there. It's just not in a consistent order or framework for you. So that's how you can manage that.
So the standards and guidelines are going to give us the details of what we need to collect in each of the data domains. It looks fantastic to go through this exercise. Once you've gone through this exercise, how do you manage the fact that there are people in the field that have been doing things a certain way for the past 20 years, and over time they're going to continue to do the same thing unless they're encouraged to change? And what I've seen in the past is that if we don't put some type of control mechanism in place, the data gets corrupted again. How do you work with your clients to keep the data in a sustainable format, following the standards and guidelines that have been defined? Yeah,
so this is where we can definitely take advantage of the work we've just done. Typically, this is like a 1-month workshop to do the EAM objects, functional location, equipment, bill of materials, throw in materials, the big four, as I call it. So give us a month and a few people will measure all your data, look at your standards, make suggestions on what the standards should be so we can get started. Once you have that, the tools we use to measure the data, you put in place to keep that in place. So we use things like data services. So we built a job that measures the data. After you go live with your new data, you can continue to use those tools to report on changes. So a master data specialist can be watching that, hey, are the serial numbers on our pressure safety valves, the quantity of them improving in that field, or are all of a sudden people entering pressure safety valves without it? So you're now able to feed back to your organization, hey, you need to be putting in the serial numbers for PSVs, please fix it. So it helps you to measure and keep enforcing that data down to the field. Because like you say, people have been doing it for 20 years, they have to have a reason to change. If you can't measure it, you can't help enforce it or reinforce it to your employees that they need to be doing this data properly. So that's one of the tools. And we also use, and here's an example of a dashboard that Information Steward provides, that you can actually see the quality of the fields and monitor them going up and down when you pull up your dashboard and say, oh, look, the data's getting better, or it's getting worse. So this helps you really monitor what's going on with your data, so you're able to feed that back out from a manual perspective. So the tools you use to measure your data, get your data clean, you leave them in place to continue to monitor the data going forward into the future.
Oh, that's fantastic. So we've gone through setting up the standards and guidelines. We've figured out how to measure what's important from a company perspective, and then we figured out how to monitor it long term and keep an eye on the standards that are the most important to us. How do we figure out how to make the transition to better data governance? Like as I said, many folks are doing things the same way that they've done it for 20 years. How do we encourage them to change? And what tools are available to help make that transition?
Yeah, definitely, because the one thing I say to all our clients is, yes, we're here to clean your data, and I don't want to have to come back and clean it again in 2 years. You're investing a lot of money into this data. We'd rather come back and when you bought a new company, because you've grown so much that we get to process that data and put it into your standards for you. That's far more fun to do. So yeah, how do you do that? Well, there's a new tool that's come out. That's called Master Data Governance that SAP uses. And what that does is it allows us to take all these rules we just built and we're measuring and monitoring and using to clean. We can actually now put them into the system that allows it to control on a field-by-field level data entry. And not just for SAP. This tool will work with Excel spreadsheets, whatever it is you use to control and monitor your data, it can talk to it, pull it in. We put it through all the rules that you have in place, your standards, your guidelines, what fields are allowed to be put in. All of those things have fields automatically fill in for you, not allow you to put in wrong information, and then it outputs it back to SAP or to whatever other tools you want. So if you have a PSV tracking spreadsheet, you can actually push the data out all the time. So now data is kept in sync from source to target using MDG and putting everything through your business rules. It's awesome when you have the standards and guidelines in place and you have a new contractor coming in to install something for you, with multiple pieces of assets in it. You can give them those standards and guidelines and say, we need you to fill in these classes and characteristics of everything you're selling us, and please fill them into these forms. Well, once they put them in, you can enter them, or they might be entering them directly into your system. They have to follow the rules that you put in place. So these business VRF pluses are the rules that you use, and it allows you to control that data from an input level. Because typically what happens in most companies is, oh, I'm installing it, I build a big spreadsheet, I use something like LSMW or something like that to migrate it into SAP, and that's done by the IT department. And from an IT perspective, it's just data. If it fits into SAP, they'll put it in. If it's the mechanic who's entering the new information about a piece of equipment, he cares because he knows he has to use that data to actually fix the pump in the future. So when you're able to take the information you're putting into the system and move it down closer to the floor, the people who are putting in it have more value to that data to them on a personal daily basis. So this tool allows that as well, that a mechanic on the floor, he's out working on a pump, oh, this is the wrong make, model, serial number, he can go and put in a change request, that data is updated for him very, very quickly. And he's putting it in the right order and sequence, and it's all controlled and governed.
What would the process flow look like for this, Alan?
Yeah, the process flow. So that's the beauty of this as well, is you actually have a workflow now where, like I was talking about the mechanic on the floor who's entering new data, or a warehouseman who's receiving a part and is adding more characteristics to that part that we're missing. Now that he has it in his hands, he's able to better put the information in. So that requester puts in a change request at their level. And they only get to see the fields they need to see. So in SAP, the user interface screens have lots of fields that you don't even use, and it's always felt cumbersome to the user. With MDG, you're allowed to only make it that you only see the fields you need to see. So a mechanic might only see the make, model, serial number. He won't see cost center and planning plants and things like that because he doesn't know what those are and he doesn't care. He just wants the right data. So once they've entered that data and it's met the business rules, they're able to send that on to the specialist. So that's where your master data specialist would look and see what data they're requesting to change and approve that data or reject it and send it back for rework. So that allows them to then do that. And then the last thing is it goes to the final person in this case for approval. Now this is totally adjustable. If you have somebody who's a super user, they're the only person that does this type of data entry, they can be a one-step workflow where it's just them, they don't have to report to anyone. Or you can have a complex one like for materials, where I've seen up to 7 different types of workflows depending on, are we just buying material, going to buy it again, so we need procurement data, are we going to put it on our inventory and on our shelves, so now we have all that data that's added to it. If it's a chemical, it has to go to the safety department for review. You can have a trigger based on plant, work location. You can have multiple work approval process. If somebody's changing a cost center, it could be now, as soon as they see that change in the cost center, it could go to the finance department for final approval. So you can route the work the way you need it to automatically. Because typically what we also find in plants, just working on a project right now where they have 10 different legacy systems. Everyone maintains their own system, but they forget to talk to each other, to tell each other that data's changed, that the other person also has in their system. This keeps that from happening because you're going to have one source of data, and it's going through this and keeping everything in sync. So if there's 3 or 4 different systems that use the same data, they're all getting the same data whenever it changes. And the right people get to see the data when they need to, according to your business design, not to what's out of the box of SAP.
Wow, that's fantastic. So just to summarize, we've dug into what some of the root causes are of the inefficiencies in the process, and figured out that data has a significant impact on those processes. Then we figured out how to go and quantify what the impact of that data is through the ADLM process that you were talking about. We were then able to focus on the most important items, figuring out what we need to fix by establishing our standards and guidelines, and then cleansing the data to those standards and guidelines. And then as we come into the final stages here, we figured out how to manage that process and apply governance to it using a tool like SAP MDG to enforce some of those standards and enforce some of those rules that we want to be applied to the data. So let's take a little bit of a look at what a business case can look like for doing something like this. So here's a number of statistics that SP has collected from their customers over the course of a number of years. So just let's take a look at some of the numbers in this chart. So capital projects and turnarounds typically in a heavy asset industry can be in the magnitude of $1 million per day if there are delays in a capital project or a turnaround. And it represents about 1.5% of the capital costs. And we know in our heavy asset industry, that's a big number. So if we can impact that number by making sure that we have the right data going in as we do our turnarounds or as we take our capital projects into the commissioning stages, then that can be a significant cost improvement. Information foundation for capital projects can be 1 to 3% of the capital budget. If we could even reduce that by 10 to 20%, we know that's a huge number that's going to improve our ability to manage and maintain equipment, to improve our warranties and items like that on our capital project handle. Safety and environmental, we can reduce the risk of our projects significantly simply by making sure that we have the right data and can comply to the safety and environmental requirements. If we can increase our plant availability by improving our maintenance practices and improving our reliability of our equipment, even a 1% increase in availability can have a significant impact. So as you can see, you can go through some of this detail, at your own company and say, well, even if we can improve some of these items, even by a small amount, can we build a business case for doing better data management? And I think the answer is a resounding yes. There's enough information in here, enough detail that's been collected over the years to say better data management is going to have a significant impact on all of your business processes around managing and maintaining your heavy assets. Let's go to the next slide, Alan.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I've, in my experience, I've seen, where we've looked at data, let's say 360,000 materials were the starting point. And by the time we applied all of the ADLM to it and understood what parts we really needed, we only moved over 160,000 parts. So, just in and of itself is understanding your data better and how much you can save. And we identified like $1.4 million of inventory marked do not use, obsolete, sitting on the shelf still. Things like that just jump off the page. Multiple duplicates of material numbers and things. So, 27 of the same exact part with 27 different material numbers. Those are the things we're standardizing. Taxonomy make a huge difference in savings to the companies as well.
So, and even improving the shop floor productivity for maintenance, even by a mere 5%, can have a significant impact to our capital spend.
Yeah, and another example of that, as I was working at a company, one of the world's largest companies, and they'd done an internal study where they showed that at 1.5 hours a day is spent by each tradesman dealing with materials. And so even improving the materials will reduce that time spent, and they'll get more time on the tools.
So let's go through a couple of case studies here. We did some work for Apache around a single domain, and we were only looking at vendor and what the implications would be for running a single domain better. The objective was to achieve a 1% reduction in spend, and that meant $95 million a year. So the business case that we went in with was, with a $3.8 billion adjusted earnings, it equates to about 2.5% increase in profitability. If we took 2% reduction in spend, we'd have about a 5% improvement in profitability. So by focusing on the vendor master data alone, we're able to achieve a conservative 0.1% reduction in spend. So even if we're able to achieve 1/10 of what we're expecting to achieve, it equates to $9.5 million annually in savings. So as you can see, even taking a fraction of what the expected benefits are, it's very easy to build a business case for doing something like this. What the expected results were, and I must admit they've just gone live recently, so we haven't got measurable results yet. But what their expected results are, if we are to achieve the 10% of the expected savings and the 1% savings in spend, that's $9.5 million. And even if only 1/3 of that is directly attributed to the implementation of governance around vendor master, it means that there's over $3 million saving annually. And the other 2/3, we can attribute to non-data cause effects. Over 5 years, that means $15 million in savings. Their total investment was $500,000. They expect the ROI for this to be in the neighborhood of 30x. So as you can see, even taking a fraction of an expected business case, it's very easy to build a business case for better data management. So Suncor has implemented the MDG for materials, equipment master, functional location, and bill of materials. And they're now governing over 2 million records with the governance solution that Alan was talking about. So their objectives were actually very straightforward. They were trying to improve their master data process time. So they had a master data process that was a bit tedious, and the churn in that process was causing them to look at this significantly. So their improvement in the process timeline was one of their number one objectives. They also wanted to improve their adherence to the data standards. So they put a huge amount of effort into defining what those standards were, but how did they go ahead and roll that standard out to the field? And of course, improving data quality was the third objective. So they've gone live approximately 3 months ago, and recently took a bit of time to define what the metrics are to define success. The initial indicators that they've seen so far are very positive. It suggests that their improved master data processing time has improved significantly due to the reduced churn in the process. What they also found was that the actual number of requests for master data changes across the board were reduced simply because of the better search capabilities that they had. And Alan talked a little bit about the standards to the data and a correct taxonomy. What they found was that applying the taxonomy allowed the end users in the field to actually find their equipment, find their materials, and not put the requests in to begin with.
Yeah, Jonathan, that's so true. Just as an example of that comes to mind, and sorry to jump in, is Cooper Cameron being spelled 75 different ways. So when you were looking for something from Cooper Cameron, you could type it in, but you're not necessarily going to find that record. And that's why people would make more records, because they couldn't find the one that they thought was there, but somebody misspelled it or spelled it differently. It's amazing how just simply standardizing a manufacturer name makes the requests drop off, because people actually find the right thing.
So some of the other things that they noted, the success rate in processing the requests to completion improved dramatically, and it's up nearly at 100%, 99.7% or something like that. And as part of the reason is because of the incorrect requests are simply eliminated by going through the process and the governance in that process. So they're able to complete the vast majority of the requests that they get in. And of course, with the application of the rules for the standards and the guidelines, their data quality is improved dramatically because it's instead of relying on human input, they're actually able to bring the drop downs that Alan was talking about and apply correct data based on the type of data that and the location of the data that's being entered. And of course, they're able to improve their compliance to the critical data standards simply because they're being enforced. Now, I will say that we need to be careful about how we enforce the data, because in some cases we want to make sure that the data standards are adhered to. In other cases, we want to make a softer recommendation. Hey, you're not following the data standards, but we don't want to stop you from going ahead and doing your job. So we'll allow this to go to the next step, but keep in mind you do have to go collect this data. So that resulted in a massive improvement in their process. I fully expect that they'll also see some of the benefits that we saw a couple of slides ago that will impact their business processes significantly. It's a little harder to measure that stuff because the improvements in the field in wrench time and in wait time for materials is a little tougher to measure, but it certainly is a benefit that they'll see along the way. So that brings us to the end of the presentation part. We'll open it up for questions. Alan and I have been in the field for a long time and very willing to answer any questions you might have.
Some of the questions that have come in so far is, the first one is, does this analysis include inherited data from superior functional location or superior equipment?
Yes, absolutely. We as one of the measures, that's what we look for, is where the inheritance hierarchy is broken in SAP, because people have entered things manually. So we also measure that, and we can go in and fix that inheritance where it's broken. So yes, we definitely look at inherited fields. Those are ones that are so important. And we also look for things like we have a piece of equipment that's been retired, but it's attached still to an active functional location, or the other way around. A functional location is retired, but all the equipment and everything underneath it is still active. So we look for things like that in the data. So whatever you want to do for your business, we set it up and measure it that way so we can pull those records out and correct them to what they need to do.
What would an ADLM workshop look like, and who would need to be involved?
That's a great question. Our workshops, and I did talk about that a little bit, is typically it's about a month that we're on site, depending on how much data and how many objects we're doing. We come in, we'll get your standards and guidelines. The people we need are your subject matter experts, who are your master data specialists, or the person who's entering and the owner of that data. So we need somebody from IT, because we need to know how to get to access the data, where those tables are, or whatever systems you're using. We also need people from the business who know the importance of the rules that they want to apply to the data. And sometimes we even get down to the end of it where we have to have people in the field do some validation for us. So we'll probably get some people that help us with that. The other thing we like to do, if we're going onto a bigger project, is we'll actually go in the field and we'll find like 30 pieces of equipment and we'll enrich them fully. And the purpose of that is to show, if we take 10 of your newest pieces of equipment, what's your data look like? What, do you have it all electronically? How can you get that data out, enrich those records? Let's look at something that's highly regulated, let's say 10 pieces of equipment off a boiler or something like that. What kind of records do you have for that? And then we might look at your oldest equipment, something that's been installed in the 60s. What kind of data do you have to support that? So we can understand what it's going to take to do the entire process from cradle to grave, to take your data from where it is today to where you want it to be in the future. And that can be a multi-generational plan. This doesn't have to happen. The implementation of the plan doesn't have to happen in a year or anything. You can have a 5-year plan because you want to budget for it, but you want to make the most important steps first. So that's what ADLM brings, and the type of people we need at the table.
The next question is, our standards and guidelines are not where they need to be. How would I improve this in order to move ahead with a program like this?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and that's one we get all the time. And that's the importance. Is we want to come in and measure your data and profile it right up front. And now that we've profiled it, we're able to now look at the standards, if you have standards and guidelines, or in this case, poor ones, and we'll look at that data, and now we can go field by field and say, okay, this field has 12,000 records that are from a company that you bought 8 years ago. What do you want to do with that data? Do you want to change it? Do you want to grandfather it? And what do you want that data to look like in the future? So we literally go field by field of that data set, looking at each rule. And those become your standards and guidelines that you apply as we decide how we want the data to be in the future. So that's that iterative process we do for that month while we're there, of going back and forth, understanding each field, what data is in it, and how we want to govern that going forward.
Based on the discussion, I understand the implications for equipment and associated information, but can this process be used for objects other than EAM?
Oh yes, absolutely. We've done this for cost centers, vendor masters, service masters, where we've gone in, looked at transactional data, a cost center, for example, where we said if there hasn't been a posting against a cost center for 2 years, we want to highlight that so that cost center could be looked at for retirement, things like that. So we can do the same process because it's all about data. It's all the same foundation. What are your standards and guidelines? What are your practices? What does the data really tell you? If we were to apply those standards, what data falls out? And again, figure out what to do with that data that's left that doesn't meet standards, either create new standards or clean the data to what it needs to be. So yes, we can do it across multiple objects.
You may have talked about this, but how long does a program like this take to be effective?
Typically 4 to 6 weeks, and you get a lot of great deliverables. Like I was talking about, here's a report that says here's all your obsolete materials, here's a list of all your duplicates already grouped. If it's SAP, we can even include the bin numbers and inventory counts and all of that. So you can literally hand a warehouseman that report and say, hey, these 6 parts look like they're duplicates. Could you please go pull them off the shelf and tell us if they're truly duplicates or if we need more information to make unique parts again. We do those type of things. Again, addressing broken inheritance is another one where we can fix that inheritance very quickly. You can do that yourselves. You don't need us to be there after that month. So I like to give reports that are usable and add value right away out of the gates. If here's a list of all your pressure safety valves that are missing serial numbers, there's the report. Send it out to the field, get them to fix those numbers up in your system. So you're able to actually start implementing things right after the workshop that actually almost immediately pay for the cost of the workshop.
So I'll just add a little color to this one as well. If you look at the program that Alan has talked through from start to finish, putting right down to the governance aspect of it, that can be a longer program. But in the ADLM workshop that Alan leads at our customers, he actually builds a roadmap to build a plan to tackle the most important things first on that timeline. So as Alan said, you start to become effective in this program right off the bat. And as you step through the program, each step along the way adds to that effectiveness. So an entire program, well, you can't do it in 6 weeks. If you go down the path of the cleansing that Alan was talking about, updating your standards and guidelines to be more up to date, and then go down the path of putting a governance program in place. And that can take a number of months, to do for a number of domains. But it's designed in such a way so that you can be effective and get results every step along the way.
Will I need to make changes to my organization for this to be effective? If so, how?
From an organizational perspective, it's tough to pull people from the distributed organization into a centralized organization. So the way that this program is designed is that everyone has to have the right level of input and control, but the organization can remain distributed. So, for example, you might have several different plants or sites with different requirements. Assigning a lead for each of the domains to coordinate in that site can be as simple as putting that title or putting that role into that site, and then centrally you want to roll some of your approvals more up to the corporate level. Well, that doesn't necessarily need to be at the corporate office. It can be a group of folks that are distributed among your sites that have that final approval. So the short answer is it may make sense to change some of your organization, but it's definitely not necessary to be effective.
And Jonathan, to add to that, that's where you get a center of excellence that represents the breadth of your company. All the locations that sit at the table and decide on standards and guidelines, they don't have to change locations. Is there a change to the organization? I would say that there will be changes in your organization because the way you've been doing your work has got you the data that you now deserve and that you have. So you're going to have to change the way you think about your data. And some roles may even change once you start applying this, where people have been doing things in the past, they no longer have to do them because you have governance and things like that in place. They can now work on more value-add things for your company. So yes, it will affect your organization. You're going to have to change the way you think about your data and how you manage your data, but this is a far more effective process. So people can now have more time to do their real jobs, because a lot of times master data is something that's put on everyone's back burner, and there's a pile of documents on my desk that I'm supposed to update in the system, but it's a 6 months backlog. People still don't necessarily look after master data the way they need to today, and that's what's going to change in your organization. A tool that makes it easier for everyone to put in the data as they find it, and it's being put directly into the system, not being passed from one office to another. So those are the type of changes you will see in the organization for sure.